The enemy outside is defined by the fact that you think he's out there trying to come in. He's outside the community's gates. The details vary at different times and places, but several characteristics of this narrative recur. There's the image of the world outside the community's gates as an unfriendly wilderness where evil forces dwell. There's the proclivity to see those forces as a centralized conspiracy guided by a puppet master or a small cabal. There's the fear of the border zone where cultures mix, the suspicion that aliens at home are agents of a foreign power, and the fear that your community might be remade in the enemy's image. And there's the tendency to see this conflict in terms of a grand apocalyptic struggle, sometimes literally against Satan, and if not against him, then against something deeply evil. The classic case, the first case in American history, is fear of Indian conspiracies. And then the second great classic case is the fear of Catholic conspiracies. The Indian conspiracies tended to embody white Americans' fear of the anarchic New World. Papal conspiracies embodied their fear of the aristocratic Old World that they left behind. Naturally, there were all sorts of stories in which the Indians and the Catholics were working together because, they always do, I guess. Next is the enemy within. And the most essential element of the enemy within is that anyone could conceivably be or conceivably become a part of the conspiracy. With the enemy outside, the conspirators are conspicuously alien in some way. Here, the plot permeates ordinary society. The classic example, of course, is the Salem witch trials. A pop culture example are the invasion of the body snatchers and all of its various kindred stories about pod people, where even you might be made a part of the conspiracy in the end without wanting to. Next, the enemy below. In this story, as with the enemy within, the community's foe is found inside the city's gates. But these conspirators are not indistinguishable from everyone else. They hold a distinct position at the bottom of the social pyramid, which they aim to overturn. They are alien but familiar with a well-defined place in society, perhaps even an essential role in the economy. If the enemy within can be imagined as a mob whose members have been seduced or conned into losing their individuality, becoming pod people, then the enemy below is presumed to be not quite human in the first place, a bestial force with monstrous appetites, a collective id eager to rape, boon, loot, and massacre. These images come up a lot in the old stories about slave conspiracies, the fear of plots behind slave revolts. The pop culture example is not pod people, but zombies. Early zombie stories, you might remember if you're a horror movie buff, they sort of stress the power of the monster's masters, who are able to sort of control people as though they're in a trance. Later zombie pictures sort of drop the master from the equation. From Night of the Living Dead on, zombies are appetites on autopilot, released from all control. And the idea of the fear at the heart of the story of the enemy below rests on, there are two great anxieties. One is that a subversive force could somehow step into that role of the mesmerizing master, and the other is that the master might disappear altogether, transforming those zombie slaves into an unrestrainable zombie rampage. Next, we have the enemy above. To borrow a phrase from the Founders' Day, this is the silent, powerful, and ever-active conspiracy of those who govern. These are conspiracies in the government, large corporations, other powerful institutions. In the media, the phrase conspiracy theory is often used as though it refers only to enemy above theories, and you needn't even invoke a conspiracy to earn the conspiracy theorist tag sometimes, as long as you entertain some suspicions about the people in charge. In the 1990s, Daniel Pipes, the neoconservative historian, wrote a book about conspiracy theories in which he attacked the Cato Institute as not necessarily a hotbed of conspiracy theories, but he singled out something a foreign policy analyst here had written, and the quote that he sort of gave as an example of a conspiracy theory was, "Today's proponents of global leadership envision a role for the United States that resembles that of a global hegemon." This does not strike me as exactly tinfoil hat territory, but that's the way that the enemy above stories get treated. On the one hand, if you're suspicious of the people in charge, even if you're not invoking a conspiracy theory, you might be called a conspiracy theorist. If you're invoking wild conspiracies, but you have a position of authority and influence, you aren't necessarily tagged as a conspiracy theorist because you're talking about outsiders, not about elites. And then finally, the benevolent conspiracy. And that's a secret force working behind the scenes to improve people's lives, Rosicrucians, benevolent extraterrestrials, angels. If the other four archetypes are secularized or sometimes not so secularized ways of talking about the devil, this is a secularized or not so secularized way of talking about God. You see it a lot in New Age circles, and often then someone who writes about the benevolent conspiracy, then their literature gets cited as evidence of the evil conspiracy by someone who figures they've just found somebody confessing the truth. So the first half of the book lays out these five narratives and looks at particular examples from the American past, generally from the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And then the second half of the book looks at the last 50 years of American history or so with the toolkit that I laid out in the first half. And I'm not going to take you through it step by step, but I will talk about two things in particular that come up in it. Well, actually, three things. One is sort of the emergence of a self-aware conspiracy culture. And in the wake of someone like Hofstadter writing that there is a quote-unquote paranoid style, it becomes easier with that sort of idea in mind for people to sort of say, all right, well, I'm suspicious. Let's see what other paranoid people are saying. And you can have magazines with names like Conspiracy Digest, Conspiracies Unlimited. And then as sort of an extension of that, you get what I call the ironic style in American conspiracism, which is people who they don't so much want to espouse a conspiracy theory or debunk it as play with it. They want to come up with sort of elaborate conspiracy narratives that maybe they're just supposed to be funny, maybe they're supposed to make a satiric point, maybe there's metaphors in there to be mined. The classic example of an ironic conspiracy text would be the Illuminatus trilogy, a cult novel that came out in the mid-'70s. The Church of the Subgenius, if you're familiar with them, are also an example of the ironic style. And then the third, finally, is sort of the modern strains of elite paranoia. Because I think that, as Gene said in his introduction, the people in power, by the definition of the word power, have greater capacity to do ill. And I'm much more worried about the paranoia of people in the government and mass media than I am about outsiders. And I would say that in the 21st century, there have been three especially potent sort of episodes of elite paranoia. And each time you can sort of pair it with a form of outsider paranoia that was more likely to get tagged as a conspiracy theory, but didn't have nearly as much impact. Right after 9/11, of course, you had the so-called 9/11 truth movement saying it was an inside job and so on. But the much more potent form of paranoid thinking that hit the country after 9/11 was the sort of fear where you see a little bit of coffee creamer spilled in an airport and suddenly there's an anthrax attack underway, or a whole neighborhood in Texas gets shut down because some sort of jerry-rigged contraption is spotted in someone's mailbox. In that case, it's a true story. It turned out to be an 8-year-old science project. And what's sort of telling about that event is not that somebody thought, all right, World Trade Center, Pentagon, obviously some neighborhood in Texas is going to be the next target, although that's interesting in itself. But it's that after they found out what it was, the police still felt the need to confiscate it just in case. The second sort of great 21st century episode of elite paranoia is Hurricane Katrina, or in general, actually, the whole reaction to big natural disasters. But Katrina is a good synecdoche for that because, again, this centralized, militarized response to Katrina, which not only was so ineffective, but got in the way of so many people's efforts to help out the victims of that storm in the aftermath, was driven to a large, both by this general idea that there's a bestial mob out there and by these wildly inaccurate rumors. People firing at the helicopters, the riot-like conditions in the Superdome and so on. And again, you heard more people talking, if someone discussed paranoia in the wake of Katrina, you were more likely to hear about the people who thought the government deliberately blew up the levees. But the much more potent form of paranoia was the kind that seized FEMA and agencies like that. And then more recently, after Obama took office, and to some extent during the election campaign, some of the reaction to Sarah Palin and her fans. Obviously, a lot of Tea Partiers have conspiracy theories. I write about the birthers in the book for a few pages, but there's also, there was this sort of this effort to see these disconnected crimes, the shooting at the Holocaust Museum, the assassination of an abortion doctor in Kansas and so on, as part of this sort of rising tide of fascist violence. In fact, the data that, to the extent that we have data, the number of incidents of right-wing violence in America was falling in 2009 and 2010. You wouldn't have guessed that from the moral panic that was going on in the media. And I should say, if you want to see there are other episodes of elite paranoia in the last decade, zero tolerance in the schools, some of the anti-Occupy rhetoric, the scare about leaks that's going on right now in the federal government. But I think those three are especially good examples. And one sort of connecting thread is after 9/11, one response was to create the Department of Homeland Security. One reason why we had such a centralized, militarized response to Katrina was because FEMA had been swallowed by the Department of Homeland Security. One of the great moments in the anti-Tea Party panic, or this actually was written before the Tea Party movement emerged, but of that moment was this report that Gene quoted from that came out of the Department of Homeland Security. So this raises the possibility not just of elite paranoia, but institutionalized paranoia.